Everyone who has done any kind of creative work has experienced the state of mind in which, after long labor, truth or beauty appears, or seems to appear, in a sudden glory. I think most of the best creative work in art, in science, in literature, and in philosophy has been the result of such a moment. Bertrand Russell. If you've been tuning into Quite Useless this season, you know that I've been doing a series of episodes inspired by the allegory of the cave from Plato's Republic. Last episode, I took a look at the art of philosophy, discussing artistic devices used by various philosophers, including Plato. Perhaps the most famous and controversial claim made in the Republic is that there is no place for dramatic poets and performers in an ideal society. I opened the last episode by pointing out the irony that this claim arrives within a text that itself makes extensive use of dramatic devices. The whole thing is written in the form of scripted dialogue. I want to return to this apparent contradiction and try to come up with ways that we might negotiate it. But first, let's take a look at the substance of the argument being made. First, Socrates is concerned about the moral character of actors. All habits are learned through imitation, he proposes. Because actors are in the business of imitating many different kinds of people, good, bad, and ugly, they cannot be wholeheartedly engaged in the imitation of the good, wise, and righteous, the lifelong practice of which is the imperative of every citizen of the Republic. Therefore, in spite of the brilliance of their craft, they have no place in this society. Second, Socrates is concerned about the effect of dramatic narratives on the audience. He didn't categorically rule out all art or even all storytelling. Tales of the gods and heroes may be told to young people in order to instill moral virtues in them and a healthy adoration for the divine. But the kind of entertainment peddled by playwrights and acting companies had a different effect. They tended to excite the senses and to put the audience in a state where they are inclined to make judgments based on emotion rather than reason. This, for Socrates, was perilous. Philosophy was aimed, before all else, at helping us to unshackle ourselves from the painful vicissitudes of our surging emotions, and a just society, like a just individual, must be guided by reason rather than outrage or anger, sadness, or sympathy. Now, having begun my career as an actor, I have some thoughts about the first prong of this attack, concerning the moral character of performers. But let's set that aside and look instead to the second part, concerning the effect of dramatic narrative on the audience. This is really the main claim that Socrates is making. The prevailing modern conclusion is that Plato really botched this one. Professor Alexander Nehamas of Princeton University devoted a 1999 lecture entitled Culture, Art, and Poetry in the Republic to combating Plato's prohibition. Professor Nehamas begins the lecture with this provocation. Plato's Republic is, I hope, one of the most disturbing books you have ever read. After painting the vision of an artless society as dystopian, he proceeds to dismantle the argument on substantive grounds. He draws parallels to the puritanical impulse that perennially recurs in many societies, including our own, in response to new and unfamiliar modes of artistic expression under the banner of protecting standards of decency. Whether that's the state banning female performers on stages in feudal Japan or Elizabethan England, Hollywood studios agreeing to forbid bad language, nudity, and all kinds of other stuff through the middle of the 20th century, or my third-grade geography teacher proudly sharing with our class that she didn't let her children watch The Simpsons because she believed it set a bad example. Is this kind of puritanical prohibition really what Plato was suggesting, though? Could he really have been in agreement with my third-grade geography teacher? Or was he up to something else? I'm Greg Beam, and this is Quite Useless. Welcome to Quite Useless, a podcast about art and its role in our lives. This is the fourth and final episode in a series inspired by Plato's Republic. And to round out the series, I decided to take the bull by the horns and wrestle with Plato's famous, or infamous invective against art. In every epoch and every society, I suspect, we could find examples of the arbiters of good taste and proper moral hygiene worrying that this or that kind of art poses a grave risk to impressionable minds, the minds of young people especially, though not exclusively. Some modern examples of this sort of thing include the intermittent banning of just about every great novel of the 20th century, the Stalin regime expelling or executing any literary, theater, or film artist who didn't strictly conform to the artistic and ideological mandates of socialist realism, protests at productions of plays like Angels in America and the Laramie Project, accusations that Harry Potter is the work of the devil, and of course J.K. Rowling has found herself in the peculiar position of facing boycotts from both the right and the left, though the latter has nothing to do with the perceived effect of the work on the reader. But I digress. Recent targets of this kind of pearl-clutching paranoia also include gangster rap and violent video games. It's no secret that despite there being little to no evidence that video games inspire real-world violence, there is no shortage of conservative pundits who would gladly lay the blame at their feet while maintaining that lack of gun control has nothing to do with the problem. Lest I give the left a pass here, I might also mention that there's an argument to be made that the social justice imperatives held by some gatekeepers in the book and film industries express a similar impulse to limit the kind of work that is produced and available for consumption. In his 2018 article, Film Critics' Insufferable Wokeness is Reinstituting a Moral Code for Movies, Oren Konheim makes the argument that, well, Film Critics' Insufferable Wokeness is Reinstituting a Moral Code for Movies. It's a pretty on-the-nose title. There are serious weaknesses in Konheim's analysis, from cherry-picking data to ignoring the very different power differentials at work in the two instances of perceived censorship he's equating. But it's not an entirely specious argument. The letter published in Harper's a few months ago and signed by dozens of academic and artistic luminaries, setting off a firestorm of backlash, seems to issue from the same intellectual impulse as Konheim's article. They want to equate any form of social or commercial censure with actual censorship. As plenty of folks have already pointed out, there are a couple of problems with the Harper statement. One, there's a real difference between criticizing or refusing to provide a platform for work you find offensive and actual censorship. Two, there is a totally reasonable claim to be made that some kinds of speech or expression really shouldn't be tolerated. In a July article published in Vox, Zach Beauchamp argues that the debate over so-called cancel culture isn't actually about free speech, but about what kinds of speech are harmful and how much of this harm a society is willing to tolerate. Citing the philosopher John Stuart Mill, he explains that managing the boundaries of acceptable discourse has a long tradition in liberal democracies, with standards and restrictions changing over time. There are many things that once would have been acceptable that are now taboo or outright verboten. Conversely, there are things I wouldn't hesitate to say publicly on this podcast that the U.S. founding fathers would have blanched at, if they'd even understood what I was talking about. It is a reasonable, even necessary process within a society to carve out limitations on harmful speech. Things like libel and defamation, for instance, are rightly prohibited, as are incitements to violence and hate speech. By extension, I think it's fair to say, even in a free society, that some art maybe shouldn't be made or supported. I doubt there are many people today who would watch something like Triumph of the Will, Leni Riefenstahl's documentary about a Hitler rally, for any reason other than historical study. An American counterpart like D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation stands in a similarly calumnious state in the minds of most viewers, and rightly so. We see these films as works of art that could and did corrupt the minds and morals of the people watching them, that were used as rallying cries for toxic, murderous campaigns, as vehicles for oppression. Now, I'm picking low-hanging fruit with these two examples, to be sure. Even so, regardless of how your particular ideological compass is oriented, it shouldn't be too difficult for you to find more nuanced examples, on the one hand, of work that offends you or that you deem dangerous, and on the other hand, of people who you think freak out way too much about art and entertainment that you find benign or even wholesome. It seems that a lot of us think that there are works of art out there that could or do cause harm. It's just that we disagree about which works those are and what exactly makes them dangerous. So perhaps it's fair to ask, was Socrates right? Should we be worried about what kinds of narratives we, and even more so our children, are consuming? I'm of two minds on this subject. To begin with, I know plenty of sensitive, conscientious, entirely moral people who enjoy partaking of or even making art that is violent or in some way lurid and graphic, work that might be regarded as obscene or even deranged in some quarters. And the folks I know who create this kind of work are sweet, kind people with sweet, kind, wholesome families. I myself have seen plenty of boundary-pushing movies and read some deviant literature, and I don't recall a time that I felt inspired to imitate any of those stories. On the other hand, as a film professor, I regularly impress upon my students the profound and insidious power of popular media to influence our opinions and to shape our worldview. The whole framework of our social ideas is, to a large extent, constructed out of and framed by the media we consume, both actively and passively. And most powerfully, I think, by the narratives we absorb. Stories are fundamental to the development and articulation of moral concepts and attitudes. And contemporary audiovisual media are a potent vehicle or catalyst for the formation of those concepts and attitudes. If we believe that a 30-second advertisement can instill in us an affinity for Coca-Cola or Volkswagen or Camel cigarettes, a belief substantiated by the billions of dollars those companies pump into their advertising budgets, why should we doubt that a 3-minute song, a 2-hour movie, a 300-page book, or a video game that can be played endlessly might align our thinking with a particular ideology, stimulate unhealthy psychological habits, or even encourage maladaptive behaviors? Narratives and media are meant to affect our thinking and, by extension, to influence our actions, right? Artistic propaganda is well known for its ability to shape minds and steer people towards specific affiliations. See, again, Triumph of the Will and Birth of a Nation. So why should we doubt that other art, even if it's created without a particular ideological agenda in mind, should be any less potent? How can we espouse a belief in the potential of stories to change people for the better without admitting the inverse potential, to damage and corrupt them? I don't think we can. In my view, stories have the capacity to help us organize our ideas, to focus and align our values, to forge and strengthen communities and cultural identities, all of which are generally positive, even essential, psychological and social functions. These are the main things that stories do for us. The pleasure we derive from them, their entertainment value, is a Trojan horse for the delivery of these deeper benefits. Yet, just as a taste for calorie-rich foods may support our survival in environments of scarcity, but compromise our health in conditions of abundance, the alluring aspects of stories may also have the capacity to confuse, corrupt, distort, and damage our thinking. It is disingenuous and frankly incoherent to highlight the ability of art to do good without acknowledging its potential to do harm. Stories can hurt us. Art can hurt us. In 1977, under the pseudonym Richard Bachman, Stephen King published a short novel titled Rage, about a disturbed teenager who holds his high school class hostage at gunpoint, killing several people in the process. It was later anthologized in a collection of 4 novels called the Bachman Books, a copy of which I inherited from my brother when I was 12. I read Rage. and I wasn't inspired to get a gun or terrorize my classmates after reading it. But some young people may have been. Rage was implicated in several school shootings during the 80s and 90s. In response, Stephen King let the novel fall out of print, later writing that it was a good thing. Although he couldn't be sure if the book had actually caused anyone to commit murder, he said it might have been an accelerant. And that was enough to make him think the responsible thing to do was to pull it from the shelves. King may have been overly cautious here. If he was, however, it's because he understands the power of literature, as you would expect from a guy who's written approximately 8,000 novels. Books can be dangerous. Movies can be dangerous. Music can be dangerous. They are often dangerous to the status quo or to oppressive power structures, which is why authoritarian regimes are so quick to clamp down on free artistic expression. But the picture isn't as simple as the sticker on Woody Guthrie's guitar, "This machine kills fascists." That may be true, but if art has the power to topple authoritarian regimes, surely it can do other kinds of damage as well. And perhaps a degree of caution is in order, as opposed to unbounded freedom of expression. If Stephen King was erring on the side of caution, Socrates was doing the moral equivalent of putting the kids in football gear before strapping them into their car seats and driving 20 miles an hour with the flashers on, or not even taking the car out of the driveway in the first place. He wanted to ban all dramatic narratives because of their potential to distort our moral reasoning, regardless of the cognitive, psychological, or social benefits that attending a play might have. Talk about throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Could Plato, in writing down Socrates' supposed argument, have been serious about this? Maybe. Perhaps if he lived today, he would think that we'd all be better off living in a society where there are no more Fast and Furious movies to addle our brains and we can focus on serene contemplation and pro-social habits. I have that inclination myself sometimes. Or maybe Plato predicted that readers down through the ages would react as they have, perceiving this blanket prohibition as overkill. Maybe Plato knew that the argument he had Socrates lay out was susceptible to the kind of refutation that Professor Nehamas delivered in the lecture I mentioned earlier. Maybe the faulty conclusions drawn by Socrates are themselves the point. Professor Nehamas describes how a casual conversation about old age, through an immense series of small steps, to which, though most seem reasonable, we are never allowed to object, results in an obsessively detailed description of a social organization in which most people in this room would have ended up either as laborers or soldiers through no obvious choice of our own. And I would add as an aside, some art is banned. The trajectory of this unfolding process is what has always struck me most about the Republic, far more than any of the particular views espoused or conclusions reached. It seems to me that what Plato is offering is a demonstration of reasonable, even brilliant men proceeding logically from sound premises, and nevertheless arriving at conclusions that are totally bonkers. Why would he do this? I think he was up to something tricky. I think he was employing a conceptual device that I like to call Platonic irony. You may have heard of Socratic irony. This is a rhetorical strategy used extensively by Socrates in the dialogues, where he will adopt a posture of ignorance or naivete, asking his interlocutor to explain the issue to him. He will then, through a series of seemingly benign questions, get his opponent to make his point for him. This tactic is sometimes used by politicians and lawyers when questioning witnesses. It often begins with a preface like, "Now, I'm no expert on blank, so perhaps you could explain something to me." Getting the other person to make the point for you makes the argument more convincing and makes it difficult for them to rebut the point without seeming to backpedal or contradict themselves. This strategy is, of course, the way Plato depicts Socrates' approach to discourse. Whether the actual Socrates debated in this way is lost to history. We will never know his true thoughts or intentions. It's easy to conflate the thoughts, attitudes, and opinions expressed by Socrates with those of Plato. I've been mentioning them basically interchangeably over the last few episodes. But we ought to bear in mind that the Socrates who has come down to us is a creation of Plato, or at least Plato's interpretation of a man whom some of his contemporaries characterized quite differently. The playwright Aristophanes, for instance, gives us a very different view of the guy. As for Plato, he always hid behind the character of Socrates, never revealing what he, the author, really thought. We may, however, be able to infer some things about Plato's thinking from the way he framed the arguments and, yes, the dramatic narrative. Let me once again read the description of the overall shape of the argument given by Professor Alexander Nehamas. A casual conversation about old age, through an immense series of small steps, results in an obsessively detailed description of a social organization in which most people in this room would have ended up either as laborers or soldiers through no obvious choice of our own. The argument builds in pace, drive, and tension. It has a narrative arc to it. It plays like a dystopian thriller. The irony drips off the page. But it's a different kind of irony than that employed by Socrates. Whereas Socrates withholds his true position for the length of the argument only to more poignantly disclose it at the end, Plato never drops out of character. His true intention remains withheld, remains suspended. He never says, "You see how silly these guys are? Now here's what I really think." No. He lets the irony of presenting an opinion he finds erroneous resound through the ages, and, like a disciplined and understated literary author, allows us to find it or not to find it for ourselves. This is what I mean by Platonic irony. What I take from the Republic is that Plato doesn't want us to agree with Socrates. He wants us to view his conclusions as nutso and to wonder how the heck he and we got there. Why? Because it demonstrates that a social order conceived and dictated by one person or a small group of people, no matter how virtuous and wise they may be, is likely to produce perverse results. The Republic is a satire of centralized decision-making. Socrates proposes having a philosopher-king rule the Republic. But we've just seen how nutty even very intelligent philosophers can get when left to their own devices and not subjected to any checks and balances. When read in this way, the Republic presents itself as an anti-authoritarian treatise. It's not an appeal to the installation of a philosopher-king. The Republic is a parody of the authoritarian mindset, not an earnest expression or endorsement of it. This nuance seems to have been lost on a great many modern interpreters of Plato's work, notably the 20th century philosopher Bertrand Russell, about whom I had some things to say in the last episode. Russell spearheaded a reassessment of Plato's Republic, ushering in the new idea that the society described in the text was far less than ideal, that it was in many ways dystopian. Writing at a time when fascism was on the rise in Europe, Russell perceived totalitarian tendencies and their inequitable and dehumanizing results in the Republic. He writes, "When we ask, what will Plato's Republic achieve? The answer is rather humdrum. It will achieve success in wars against roughly equal populations, and it will secure a livelihood for a certain small number of people. It will almost certainly produce no art or science because of its rigidity. In spite of all the fine talk, skill in war and enough to eat is all that will be achieved." Plato had lived through famine and defeat in Athens. Perhaps subconsciously, he thought the avoidance of these evils the best that statesmanship could accomplish. Now, Russell isn't altogether unkind to Plato. The exultant quotation that I opened this episode with developed out of a reflection on the great Greek philosopher. In the same passage, Russell describes how philosophy for Plato is a kind of vision, the vision of truth. It would appear that he thinks, in the case of the Republic, Plato's vision simply failed him. But here, I think, Plato might have the last laugh. Were he alive, of course. It was lost on Russell, as it has been on many who followed him, that Plato's work may have been a dystopian parable. It is the misapprehension of scholars like Russell, who have mistakenly taken the text at face value, that demonstrates the deeper irony at work in the Republic. Socrates achieved high rhetorical mastery by acting as though there were no craft to his approach. He was simply pursuing the truth as forthrightly as possible. Plato used literature in a similar way. Where Socrates employs rhetorical devices to approach his point obliquely, Plato uses artistic devices to do something subtler and even more difficult to rebut. The effect on the reader's thinking results only from their engagement with the discussions of Socrates and his interlocutors, never through a direct encounter with the author's ideas. Plato maintains deniability at every step of the way. He gives the reader no way to disagree with him because he never asserts anything. He never makes any claims. And it is precisely when you think you have transcended his argument that you arrive where he intended in the first place. The point where you are thinking for yourself. Socrates may have been a masterful rhetorician. Plato, I would submit, was something even greater. He was an artist. This episode of Quite Useless was written, produced, performed, edited, mixed, and mastered by me, Greg Beam. This is the final episode of Season 2. At last. It only took me a year and 9 months. But when I started making this podcast, I decided pretty early on that I would rather spend a little extra time crafting these things into something that I at least find satisfying on a somewhat deep level, rather than try to pump out content every couple of weeks. If that means I have a smaller and perhaps somewhat annoyed audience base, I apologize, but so be it. I'm going to take some time to ponder what direction to head with Season 3. In the meantime, you can go back and listen to all of my old episodes, wherever you get your podcasts, or on the website, thisisquiteuseless.com. I'm Greg Beam, and I very much hope you'll join me for more Socratically dramatic, platonically ironic, and always quite useless adventures.